Hello, you are looking at one of the most easily recognized sword types in world history, which is funny enough given that this thing did not last very long, but it was quite popular in one time and place, as we'll discuss. This is an Italian Cinquedea, which is a short sword, as you can see, that was very popular in northern Italy during a span of the Renaissance. Basically 1490 to like 1520 is the lifespan, the useful lifespan for this still fascinating knife slash dagger slash short sword type. In fact, their fascination held for a long time, including today. I saw these two, got to hold them, because they were coming up for auction. These were highly desirable and were copied wildly during the Victorian era, so you have to be careful when you see an antique for sale, because they're just such standouts. They're really cool looking, they're fascinating, and we'll get into the many ways in which they really stand apart from so many other bladed weapons. And yes, as almost all discussions or articles about this weapon begin, Cinquedea basically means 5 fingers, so 5 fingers wide. You see the base, that very broad base. That's the idea there. That's universally used now as the name, but I have seen on and off over the years writings to the effect that the Cinquedea was originally a Venetian dagger that was 5 fingers long, not wide, and then simply the name took over for these here, and that kind of thing does happen in weapons history. It absolutely happened in my specialty, saps and blackjacks. Unlike a lot of weapons, these kind of sprang up overnight, which is one of their many interesting features. There's no earlier blades that you can then find a transitional version of and say, okay, so that's how they eventually got to this design. That happens a lot with swords and different kinds of weapons. Not really the case here. This seems more like a just kind of all-out invention where somebody might have had an inspiration from an older source, but then produced this brand new weapon. And speaking of older sources, here is the #1 guess as to that. I was glad to see in the other videos and literature that this is the primary suspect, because it didn't take me half a second to think Bronze Age swords might have been the inspiration for the Cinquedea. And that's because, of course, you see a broad triangular blade here. And notice how short that is and how broad. Well, back in the Bronze Age, that was a necessity because the material was just a lot softer, weaker than iron or steel, so it necessitated that kind of shape. Some of these ancient blades look even more Cinquedea-esque than this one in particular does, but I thought this was a really nice, crisp picture. You'll notice the median ridge there, right, going all along the length, and that's, of course, to provide strength, which again helped if you're working with bronze. And interestingly, the original Cinquedeas are not what people think of now, which we're going to see in a second, but they were almost exactly like this, right? Triangular, flat, with a ridge running down the length. So there's even more corroboration, at least for that theory. However, I'm pretty litigious about my history, and I have to say there's no actual evidence, direct evidence of that. We go along the line of thought where, Italians during the Renaissance were fascinated by all things ancient. Then we have another candidate, which is the cut and thrust sword, or the arming sword. So here's a type that I'm sure you've seen many, many times, right? Just you think of knights, and this is the sword you picture in their hand, and for good reason. Well, that cut and thrust blade is, again, triangular, and in fact this one, you can see, has a ridge as well. So, a classicist in northern Italy during the Renaissance would have been familiar with probably either of those types. And again, I don't think we have a direct way of proving or even indicating which might have been the inspiration. If either, that is, because, right, could have had some completely different origin. So here's a plate from an old book, and you can see a variety of these. So there was variation, but this is a very consistent sword type, which doesn't always happen. I mean, these are really, there's an orthodoxy here that is always there, and that's why you can pick these out very easily. The one thing you'll notice is the different lengths, and that's one of the unique features here. You call it a Cinquedea because it is one, even if it's basically a short sword, maybe even not so short of a sword, or just a dagger. So as long as it's got that form, you can see how the guard kind of curves down. It almost always does that. The broad base. Notice the texture differs, and we'll talk about that in a second. But bottom line is, you know when you see one, and they were made in a wide variety of sizes. From a martial arts perspective, there is kind of a puzzle about how these were used. When they're of any notable size, they're definitely a chopping blade. You see the rounded point that the one there on the left has? That's often the case, so that would definitely lead you to believe it's more for chopping than for thrusting. And then the smaller and or pointier ones were certainly more of a thrusting weapon, right? So here's the first of the two that I showed at the start, the ones that I actually got to see and hold. And here's what people think of as the classic Cinquedea blade. Notice the fullers, right? and that kind of lattice work. You've got these ribs, those two, so you're creating three sections, and the further you progress towards the hilt, the more fullers there are. So usually that's a 2-3-5 pattern. And that's just strange. You do not see this kind of, again, lattice work on really any other kind of sword type that I can think of. Could be missing something. But that's a definite calling card here. And you can see how that would add strength to the blade while subtracting from the overall metal. You've got such a broad blade. You don't want such a heavy chopper that it's just difficult to wield. So this is a pretty clever way, in my opinion, to get around that. Now, one thing we haven't mentioned yet is that this is a civilian weapon. This is not a weapon of war. Not even during that brief lifespan that we talked about would you run out onto the battlefield with this. So this was carried in the streets. It was for self-defense or offense, but that kind of thing. And that's kind of a little bit of a standout as well. This is a time of transition where swords got smaller. You're carrying, say, like a rapier, and again, the rapier is an espada ropera, right? It's for the clothes, ropa, clothes, so something you carry in your everyday life, and this is that type of weapon. And real quick, look at the amount of metal in the hilt there. That's pretty unusual, especially for such a short blade. But we'll progress down from that and get to the actual handle. So these were typically scaled, so right, you've got these kind of plates coming together. They could be bone, ivory, wood even, but tended to be towards the fancier materials because these were often highly decorated, as you can see on this one. This would have looked really nice back in the day when it was being carried. You can see the amount of attention of detail that went to this. And once again, it was Italy in the Renaissance. So if you're a gentleman carrying a weapon, you're going to want it to look good. So now we'll look at the other one that I got to hold, and we'll go in the opposite order, right? So we'll start at the pommel, and again, look at the degree of decoration there. You can see how both handles are similar, and if you think back to that plate that we showed, they were often like that. So these grips, probably aesthetics played a big role, but also they're very contoured, and they're meant for just grabbing in one way, right? A symmetrical handle gives you versatility if you need to change grips, that kind of thing. These were not meant for that. Here you're sacrificing, in my opinion, versatility in order to gain security. And you can see the hilt there, the degree of sophistication and work speaks for itself, obviously, right? So again, Renaissance Italy, rich man's weapon. The other thing to note about the handles, and I haven't seen this written about anywhere or talked about in any of the existing videos, is they're so small compared to the sword. Look at this blade, right? It's a big, heavy, broad blade, and you've got such a short handle that these would be very top-heavy weapons. That's the one thing when I handled them, especially the larger of the two. I just felt like I would want more handle if I'm going to actually be using this. So here's an example of the earlier blade type. And something like this could have been cut down from a larger weapon, like a polearm type weapon. Like I said, later on they were faked a lot because they were so popular, but it just comes from a very prestigious auction house, and either way it serves as a good example. So you can see the ridge, you can see the flat surface, and I think these look better, but hey, that's just me, and I wasn't around in the Renaissance. So, just how highly decorated were these? All right, speaking of the Renaissance and art, this much, and even more. So here's an example of one that was probably meant to be seen more than used, but you had it on you, and you could use it if you had to. And you can see the allure to the manufacturer here, right? He wants to make a Cinquedea, he wants to sell it for a lot of money. Well, he has a lot of space to work with because of that broad blade. So you can get really elaborate designs, especially on this part of the blade as it comes out of the hilt. And this one they went even further, obviously, in the hilt itself. It's got that same technique on there. So etching, bluing, whatever technique was used to make swords pretty was used on these during their brief tenure. It shouldn't be surprising that the scabbards for these, because they were just as broad, were also often highly decorated. And that's something I actually haven't seen or heard mentioned too often when it comes to these, but makes sense, right? If it's a showpiece and the blade gives you a big canvas to work on, so does the sheath. Very few of those, if any, survive. I've never seen a picture of one, but that is recorded. So back to these guys, the ones I saw. I'd like to take it back to the martial arts aspect again, as always. So, how successful was this design? Well, as you've seen, there have been triangular blades in the past, especially the, kind of medieval European sword that's a highly functional blade. But this length, this broad, it's pretty unique. We can't call this a overall successful design because it didn't last very long. Doesn't mean it was useless. These often get described as pure showpieces, and I don't believe that myself. Again, look how sturdy that is. The idea is that this came up in Venice. I've been there, you're walking around in very tight spaces, alleys, that kind of thing. Would it make sense that a blade like this would catch on for a while, partly because of fashion, but also because it was fairly useful? I think so. You want something you can draw that isn't going to get tangled up on things or hit up against the wall before you even get a chance to use it, that kind of thing. It's certainly highly stylized, but I do believe this is a true weapon. I would actually compare it to a couple of American knives, the gaucho knives that they would duel with in South America, and the Bowie knife in America. There's several examples of those that are just almost comically large, and it was a stylistic thing, it was a statement you were making, but they were absolutely carried and used as weapons, when the need called as well. And that will do it. Like any weapons geek, I've been aware of these for a really long time, so it was great to be able to hold a couple of actual historic examples. And I hope you liked learning a little about them. Thanks.